Welcome back to Critical Thinking. This video on public debates covers Rule 46, Listen, Learn, Leverage from A Workbook for Arguments. This rule means, in part, the skill of listening to an opponent in debate. Listening is actually a skill that can be developed. Many people are not good listeners. So someone's talking, even maybe about something important, and you're distracted by your own thoughts, or you're only focusing on how you're going to respond to what they're saying, not what they're currently saying. Or in a debate context, you're just thinking of ways of launching a counter argument without listening carefully to understand the argument that's being given. So listening is something that does not come naturally to a lot of people. You may find yourself, if you're in a public debate, being very kind of anxious or angry, maybe compulsive to respond, and impatient with the part of the debate where you're not allowed to speak. So a couple of books that might be helpful on how to cultivate the skill of listening. There's one by the journalist Celeste Headley, who's done a lot of interviews. In part, that's where she learned to develop her listening techniques. The book is called We Need to Talk, How to Have Conversations That Matter. Another source that's helpful is by the psychologist Michael P. Nichols, The Lost Art of Listening. So my understanding is he kind of honed his skills in a psychotherapeutic context. But these skills from the books can be applied to debate contexts as well. In order to gain the skill of listening well, you really have to train your mind, your emotions, your ethos to a certain degree. And that's something that can take practice. Like you can practice this skill outside of a debate context in ordinary life when you interact with your friends or loved ones, for example, or just other people you encounter throughout the day. So listening allows you to learn about your opponent's reasons for their belief and to understand their arguments. And this is good both because it helps you reply to their arguments with effective objections, or it helps you rebut their objections to your position or argument. But also, this is getting to the broader purpose of public debates. If you look at them as a potentially positive sum game, as we discussed in the last video, then you could actually learn something yourself, even from someone you initially disagree with, someone you initially regard just as an opponent. And the leverage idea is that by extending this courtesy to your debate partner, they're more likely to do the same to you. So it can actually be something that creates a norm within that debate of mutual respect, or at least mutual attention. So this concept of listen, learn, leverage is related to what's called the principle of charity in philosophy. The principle of charity says that you should be as generous as possible in interpreting your opponent's argument. So even if you disagree with the conclusion or initially with the argument itself, try to put those concerns aside and try to understand the argument as much as you can on its own terms. And there are many reasons, but two main reasons for following the principle of charity. One, especially in the debate context, is that idea of leveraging. If you do this, then your opponent is more likely to extend the favor to you. So you're establishing a kind of norm that you may expect reciprocity from your debate partner. And then the deeper reason is that, consider the possibility that you could be wrong, whether in whole or in part. For most of us, we are wrong at least about some things. Well, basically everyone is, unless you're omniscient. So the ability to give the benefit of the doubt, or to at least consider arguments for views you initially disagree with, in the long run, that's going to make it more likely that you discover the truth. And so even though you might think that, oh, geez, I lost the debate because this other person was right and I'm wrong, you were the one who actually learned something. So in that sense, you actually gained more than your opponent in terms of your knowledge. But more realistically, it's often the case that it's not that one side is completely right, the other side is completely wrong. It's possible they both have aspects of reality that they're depicting or justifying with their arguments. And so each side might be able to learn from the other. It's not to say that each side is going to learn equally. That will depend on the case, but it's at least possible in principle for both sides to learn from the other. And even if a side has the majority of things wrong, they may have some insights, some information that you didn't know. So you could still look at it as an opportunity to learn new things, to discover the truth. So as an exercise, think of an example of a time you violated this principle. And if you start to look at your thinking and your conduct more carefully, you can start to train yourself to follow the principle of charity more regularly. This will make you a better thinker, and also in the debate context, a more skillful as well as more polite debater. For my own, I can't think offhand of a specific time I violated the principle. And partly this is just a kind of veil of ignorance that surrounds us. We don't even see when we fail to extend this to others. But I do see myself engaging in what's called motivated reasoning a lot. If I'm reading a study whose conclusion I disagree with, I'm just looking for ways to criticize the study. And so that's a violation of the principle of charity. I'm not trying to give the study a full hearing based on its methods and findings. I'm just looking for flaws. So that's the sort of thing you want to be on the lookout for, and to avoid these violations of the principle of charity. There's also a tactic called steel manning. This has become, I think, a bit more widely known on the internet. My understanding is it originated in what's called the rationality movement, which is a community of people dedicated to trying to improve their reasoning skills, to understand how to evaluate arguments better, how to find the truth more reliably, etc. A few years ago, this movement was centered on a website called Less Wrong. So you can look that up. That's still active, but they're a bit more dispersed now. In any event, the steel manning concept has long since spread from the rationality movement to, I guess, the broader internet. What steel manning is the opposite of straw manning. The straw man fallacy is attacking an argument by falsely characterizing its premises, conclusion, or both. It's called the straw man fallacy because you're attacking a weakened or a dummy version of the argument rather than the argument itself. This is a fallacy because even if you can show that the straw man version of the argument is problematic, it doesn't show the original argument was a problem. So you haven't actually created an effective objection or counter argument. Steel manning is the opposite of straw manning, and it goes beyond the principle of charity in a way. Steel manning is interpreting an opponent's argument to make it as strong as possible, including making it stronger than the original argument. So you're not only just trying to represent it accurately, you're trying to make it as strong as you possibly can, even if you disagree with the conclusion. So let's clarify how steel manning differs from the principle of charity. The main difference is that the principle of charity is just trying to be as fair as possible to understanding and faithfully representing the original argument an opponent makes. Steel manning goes beyond that by attempting to strengthen it. So in a sense, you're not only paying attention to or being faithful to the original argument, you're trying to make it even stronger if possible. And what's the purpose of steel manning? Well, the purpose is like the principle of charity, but leaning even more heavily on discovering the truth. So it's not just that you are treating your opponent fairly, but you're trying to, if you're really dedicated to finding the truth more than being right, then you want to think of the strongest possible arguments for a position you disagree with. So if you are able to conclude at the end of the day that those arguments still don't work, your view is much more likely to be justified than if you had not seriously considered the strongest possible arguments for the other side. So this is a tool or a technique that will help you be more rational and more effective in discovering the truth as opposed to just winning a debate. So the principle of charity and the idea of listening and learning, these depend on faculties of empathy. There's two types of empathy that psychologists distinguish between: cognitive and affective. Cognitive empathy means the ability to understand what another person is thinking or feeling. So cognitive empathy could often be expressed as you stating verbally what you think someone else is thinking or feeling. Affective empathy is different. It's not just having a kind of theoretical understanding, perhaps verbal, of what someone else is thinking or feeling. It's being able to resonate with that yourself. It's when you actually share some of those thoughts or feelings, you're able to have an experience similar to what the other person is thinking or feeling. So you're able to share their thoughts or feelings to a certain degree. So one way I've heard this distinction used, I'm not a psychologist, so take this with a grain of salt, but I've read that people who are psychopaths often have high cognitive empathy but low affective empathy. So a psychopath is someone who is able to understand what others are thinking or feeling, and they sometimes use this to manipulate them, but they're often incapable or much less capable than people normally are of having affective empathy. So they will not be personally concerned about others' pain or suffering, even if they understand perfectly well that the person is having pain or suffering. So an interesting question is, which kind of empathy is important for debates? And the answer is probably both. On the one hand, cognitive empathy is of greater importance just to understand your opponent's argument and their reasons for holding it. But if you look at debate as something that could be a positive-sum game, then affective empathy can help motivate that mindset. If you care about the debate partners as people, if you're able to share their concerns to some degree and understand from your own experience how or why they might be feeling, then it's much more likely to create a positive sum environment for debates. One thing that should be said as well is that this applies not only to formal debates in front of audiences, but just to debates that happen anywhere, like on the internet or in daily life. If you bring these tools and mindsets with you, they're more likely to be productive. Another important distinction that's relevant to listening and learning is looking for your opponent's justifications for believing something, not just their motives for believing it. So a motive is a psychological reason for why someone believes something. And these can sometimes both be present. The justification is their logical reason or a piece of evidence that would help justify their belief. And these can overlap. So it's possible that someone originally has a psychological motive for believing something, and they look for justifications for why it might be true. So here are some examples of that. The only reason people deny climate change is because they've been duped by oil companies. Or the only reason people believe in climate change is as an excuse to tear down capitalism. These are very common types of arguments. They're attempting to object to or rebut another position. However, you'll notice they both just try to look at things in terms of psychological motives for belief. They try to reduce all of the arguments and evidence for the other side to just a psychological motive. So the only reason people deny climate change is because they've been duped by oil companies. So they maybe want to believe that the oil companies have a motive, a profit motive to deny climate change. And so they use propaganda to influence other people. There could be some truth to this, but you'll notice that you're ignoring all the possible evidence against climate change. You're only looking for the motives or the interests of oil companies and other interest groups. And the other example does the same thing. You're imputing a motive of tearing down capitalism to people who believe in human-caused climate change, probably what this is about in this case. So the reason why you want to avoid this is because even if there's some truth to both of these examples, it doesn't actually get to the evidence or justifications the other side may have. You're just ignoring them and pretending they don't exist. You're pretending that this is all about psychological motivation. And even if you strongly suspect a debate partner or someone you disagree with does have psychological motives, in order to discover the truth, just ignore those motives. Focus on the reasons or justifications they give. Because the justifications could be accurate, the argument could be effective, even if they do have this motivation behind it. So if you care about the truth, you can't just ignore the justifications. So what you want to do is to understand the rational justifications for people's beliefs by using your listening and learning skills. Let's look at a sample problem. So in this case, we're going to try to look at a brief argument and explain the author's reasons for holding a view. This was a tweet by Donald Trump. Despite the most hostile and corrupt media in the history of American politics, the Trump administration has accomplished more in its first 2 years than any other administration. Judges, biggest tax and regulation cuts, VA choice, best economy, lowest unemployment, and much more. Now, it's easy to just sort of scorn this post if you don't like or disagree with Donald Trump. You know, I personally am not a fan, for example, of the current president, just to get my cards on the table. But that's not being fair to argument. That's not doing argument proud, so to speak. It's better to actually try to unpack the reasons. Now, it's easy to be uncharitable in the case of this argument because it's kind of short. You know, it's a tweet, so the evidence is just being referred to. It's not being discussed in detail. So partly you may have to do some interpretation to even understand, you know, what he's referring to. So the judges presumably refer to Supreme Court justices he's appointed. And so if you were being charitable and trying to explain the author's reasons, you would go through this very carefully. You'll notice the first sentence, despite the most hostile and corrupt media in the history of American politics, you know, he's using some loaded language there. Now, he's not being the best critical thinker, but there may be some reality to what he's referring to. So do some research. Try to figure out, okay, how has the media, is there data on media coverage of President Trump, and how does it compare to that of previous administrations? There may be data out there. So there might actually be some truth to that claim he's making, that the media is more hostile towards him than to previous presidents. And then go through the positive evidence that he's giving. What are the justices that he appointed? And so even if you know, you might disagree with the Supreme Court choices of President Trump, partially you can look at this from the lens of people who support him. If those justices support their principles or values, then yeah, that would be good evidence that Trump has been an effective president. Biggest tax and regulation cuts. So look at the exact cuts to taxes and regulations that have been passed through during Trump's administration, and try to find as well some measures of the impact of those on the economy or other factors. VA choice. So he's talking about Veterans Affairs, I believe, and so that's some reforms to the way the VA system works. Best economy. Look at the GDP and things also like the size of the stock market during the Trump administration. Compare that to previous administrations. You know, he may well have a point there. And actually, until the coronavirus recession, the economy was doing quite well. Now, we have to be careful because it's a common fallacy that if something good or bad happens during a president's watch economically, then they're the cause of it, when in fact, generally there's lots of other causes. But still, you want to try to follow the principle of charity, seek to unpack the reasons and present them in as favorable light as possible before you give your final evaluation of the argument. Lowest unemployment. Indeed, look at the unemployment stats and see if that's correct. So you really want to slow down. If you're triggered by this, if you're an opponent of Trump, it's easy to just dismiss all these points, but in order to give the argument a fair hearing, you need to kind of list them, go through them, and even try to provide additional information that could back up these claims. So another sample problem is steel manning the view you disagree with. So these are two views about the minimum wage, one by Heather Bushey in favor of a minimum wage, one by Michael Strain against the minimum wage. So the idea is if you have an opinion about the minimum wage, if you're for or against, it's a useful exercise to go through each of these arguments or go through the argument you disagree with and try to not just present it charitably, but make it even stronger. So personally, I'm somewhat skeptical of the minimum wage because even though it does raise income for some workers, as Michael Strain points out, many economists claim it can increase unemployment, especially among vulnerable low-wage groups who may have difficulty finding jobs in the first place. But this is highly contested even within the economics profession. So it's a perfect example of something where there's a lot of evidence and arguments on both sides. And to be honest, it can be hard to figure out what the right answer is. And of course, also we want to keep in mind the minimum wage is not one thing. There's a variety of minimum wage policies that could be debated. And really those would have to be taken as individual policy proposals, not just lumped together with one thing. But that's a separate point about how you frame the issue. But let's look at Heather Bushey's argument. Raising the minimum wage means higher incomes and lower poverty rates. It makes people's lives better. A number of states have raised their minimum wage over the last few years, and incomes have risen across the board. While correlation does not imply causation, empirical studies suggest that the increase in the minimum wage was a significant cause of the rise in incomes. So yeah, there is a possible weakness there at the end with the confounding factors. We don't know, because the economy is so complicated, if the minimum wage was the cause of the rise in incomes. But either way, you could still point to the particular people who are now working at the higher minimum wage that definitely benefited those people, right? So that's something that could be pointed out there. The main idea I have for steel manning this argument is that supposedly there are also studies that show that the minimum wage does not in fact lead to unemployment. One of the main criticisms of the minimum wage is that it's expected to increase unemployment because of the way supply and demand in the labor market work. If you're increasing the price of labor, then all things being equal, you would expect there to be less quantity of labor demanded by the purchasers of labor, i.e. employees. So this is a basic principle of economics. However, if those studies are correct, that if you actually implement minimum wages and then track unemployment, at least I've seen it claimed and argued and seen some of the studies. A lot of studies claim that increasing the minimum wage does not increase the unemployment rate as you would expect. So and there are possible confounds there because the way unemployment is measured in the United States is not just the number of people working, but the number of people who are actively searching for jobs. But the point is, this is another piece of evidence Heather Bushey could leverage to support her argument that she doesn't. So if I were steel manning the argument, that's a good place where I would start.